Hi, everybody. This is Erica Mello and Susan Clinton, and welcome to podcast number 98. And this is a really interesting podcast. It was a Facebook Live we did literally almost a year ago, but it's all on the topic of functional movement, right, Susan? And
Yep.
this is our functional movement month, so to speak. And we go into a deep dive to talk about three, probably more, but three basic functional movements that I think we as therapists should assess. And we look at figuring out how to assess drivers, but from just looking at some basic functional movements. It doesn't have to be that difficult, right, Susan?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that this podcast actually simplifies the process a bit. So we're really looking for your feedback on this and what you're thinking. Also, we're going to our next podcast number 99, as we move into 100 podcasts, which will be a big landmark for us. We're going to do a Q&A, and we really would like for everybody to drop us your questions, send them to us at erica@ericamello.com or susan@embodied-pt.com. Put them on our Facebook page, whatever you want to do. But we're going to start doing some Q&As. And that also leads me to remind everybody to keep watching this summer. We're going to be releasing our podcast subscription. And in that podcast subscription will be monthly Q&As and hot seats, so people can apply. Members for our subscription can apply to hot seats and come in and have 20 minutes with us. So we're going to do some interviews and some other really exciting things that we don't have time to do on this regular podcast. So keep that on your radar and keep looking for it. We're going to be coming out with it midsummer.
Sounds good.
Yes.
Enjoy the podcast.
Yeah, podcast number 98. Enjoy. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. How are you? Here we are again.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Mm-hmm. It is Thursday at 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And here we are. I'm just going to lop out of one thing here. Sorry, I'm getting confused. There we go.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, how's everybody doing? We are, still here. We thought that today we would look at three different movements, more functional movements, and see what we can learn by just looking at one movement. For example, we're going to do like the bend over, the like forward bend, the squat, and like a step up. So we can glean a lot from looking at a functional movement pattern. So do you want to start, Susan? Do you want me to start, or?
Sure, we could start with a bend over.
Yes, that's one of your favorites, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, seems to be. I like to see how people bend over. I like to see what they will do and what they won't do.
Yes.
So the idea behind functional movement patterns and active range of motion or active movement is one of the primers for doing those, at least in my mind, is for to see the person's willingness to move.
Yeah.
What are they willing to do? What are they willing to perform? How are they doing it? And, kind of how do they get through the goal of that motion? So to me, bend overs, rather than just having somebody bend over, oftentimes I will like to say, show me how you pick up your shoe off the floor, or I'll slide their shoe over in front of them and say, pick up your shoe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I can gain a lot of knowledge that way, because one of the things that I want to do, like I said, is talk about, is look at with them is like, how are they going to get to the ground to pick up that shoe?
Yeah.
And generally when you make it super functional like that and you do it, you don't tell them what you're going to do. You just say, show me how you pick up your shoe. You're going to get their automatic movement. And that's what I'm after. I'm not after them moving beautifully because they're standing in front of a physical therapist. I'm after them actually doing something that's going to be more mimicking what they're going to actually do at home, which is why I hand them a shoe.
Yeah.
And generally it's their own shoe.
Yeah.
You could do the same thing with put your shoe on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think people who are so afraid, like if they're standing in front of a healthcare practitioner and they know they're being examined, they're going to move very differently than if they're going to just say, just pick the shoe, pick the pen up, reach for this, do that. And they're going to have more of a spontaneous movement strategy, whereas they're going to bend forward and they're going to try and do it perfectly, and they're going to go rigid. And it's funny, Susan, I often get, should I round my back or should I go straight? And so what do you say when people ask you that? Because I get that a lot. Should I round? Should I go? And I usually say, do whatever makes you feel comfortable. You do whatever you want. And that's what I generally say.
Yeah, that's usually why I just ask them to just pick it up off the floor.
Yeah.
Because I want to see what strategy they're going to automatically use. And then I'll just say, did that bother you? And if it did, tell me about that.
Yeah.
And we can talk about that. And they'll say, well, no, that doesn't bother me. And I'll say, well, does bending over ever bother you? Well, yes, when I do such and such. Okay, show me. You know, because they may use a great compensating movement pattern for bending over. And I think that's excellent. But that may not work for lifting up something heavier,
right,
or, so they'll say, well, when I go and pick up my shoe, it's not a problem. Well, when is it a problem?
Right.
So that begins to open that conversation up, because most of the time people will say, I hurt all the time.
Yes. Yeah.
It always hurts, or this and that. And so I can just say, show me how you pick up a shoe. Show me how you bend over to get this. What happens, or you can do the same thing with a piece of paper or a pen, like Erica said, how do you pick a pen up off the floor? How do you get your groceries out of the car? How do you sit at your desk? Show me.
Yeah.
Exactly how you do it. Yeah.
Yeah. And you can glean a lot. Like, we always talk about, standing and standing. And once again, this is not about standing posture, but if you see somebody, standing a certain way and they move very well out of that position, they bend forward. Who cares what they look like in standing? I mean, unless standing's a problem, but you can see hip mobility, you can see ankle mobility, you can test neural tension with a forward bend, right? That's a big one.
Right. So a lot of people are like, did you test neural tension? It's like, did they do a forward bend? Well, yes. And it's like, then that's a neural tension move, right? What happened with that movement? Did they have, where did they feel symptoms? Did they have range of motion? Where do you think they were lacking? To look at with a bend over is, are they getting all their flexion from their thorax? Do they have exceptionally long arms so that they can actually not have to bend a whole lot? Are they hip hinging? Are they bending, flexing at the hip?
Yep.
Are they flexing more in the lumbar spine? Because the lumbar spine doesn't have a tremendous amount of flexion.
Yeah.
It doesn't have some, the thorax has a lot, but where are they actually getting that motion from? Are the hips staying relatively extended while the back and the trunk are doing most of the flexing forward? And also, I think we talked last time, was it last time we talked about the shoulder or the time before? I can't remember. But Erica talked a lot about movement of the scapula, on the thorax, and the shoulders raising up and the shoulders lowering down. And I think you can see a lot of what happens in that upper quarter too with something like a bend over, because they may or may not be flexing at their hips. But what is happening also up around the scapula as they, round their trunk to bend over to do that? Is there an unusual shrug going on? Is the scapula's rounding around the body an excessive amount? And one of the things that I love too, coming right out of the MSI group, is what happens with the head.
Yes.
Do they bend over, and does their head stay in extension?
Right. That's
And and why is that happening? Is it because they have a balance issue? They don't want to look down?
Oh, that's a good point.
Their eyes to look between their knees? Or is it because neural tension wise, it's really hard for them to flex their head when the whole trunk and legs are moving into that, the legs are straight and the trunk is bending, moving into that. It's like doing a straight leg raise on your back, just kind of the same type of thing.
Yeah.
Is that where the neural tension is coming in? Is in the back of the neck, and they're not able to drop their chin down. So I can ask them, and you can actually turn this into so for those of you who are working in telehealth and are trying to kind of figure some things out, you can actually turn this into a slider and a glider and a tensioner. So bend over, let me know when you feel it right there. Can you drop your head down? Does that make it worse? Does it make it better? If you lift your head up, does it make it worse? Does it make it better?
Yep.
What happens if you don't use your arms and you bend over? Does it make it worse? Does it make it better? So you can kind of begin to play with it in that way too, because one of the things that may be going on is what happens if they bend over with their legs further apart? If you're thinking
I was
neural tension,
just gonna, yep,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly, right? Then you want to bring the feet further apart. And does it make it easier then? Can they drop their head easier now?
Mm-hmm.
And that can kind of give you a little bit of a clue. And then you're still having to decide, is this a neural tension problem or is this a balance problem?
Yes, yes,
You know, because maybe they're more willing to bend at the hip and flex forward because their feet are apart so they feel stable,
yeah.
you know, or is it because they don't feel the pull, the neural tension
The
pull?
neural tension.
Mm-hmm.
And also when they when they bend over with their feet together, you could, I mean, we talked about this recently, that, you know, when you're bending forward and your knees, your
Mm-hmm.
feet are really close together, you could potentially rule
Mm-hmm.
in or rule out a foot issue, right? If they really can't bend forward with their feet close together, they could potentially have, you know, my interest would be a little bit piqued in looking at the foot if I saw something like that. It may not be a foot, that's the foot issue, but
Mm-hmm.
I would definitely look at the foot because of that movement
Mm-hmm.
pattern.
Yeah.
You know, and you also have when people there's a lot of patients, especially I think, you know, a lot of the women that you see postpartum, they're really back on their heels, and when they're trying to bend forward, they're the and if they don't have any hip mobility. I had a patient recently who literally, I asked him to bend forward, and he thrust his hip back. He had no hip flexion. He had so much thoracic, like posterior translation. I don't think we use flexion anymore, but, you know, posterior translation of the thorax. He had no hip flexion at all, no lumbar mobility, and he had no
Mm-hmm.
dorsiflexion. So he was literally hanging on his shoulder ligaments, and he couldn't even bend over. Yes, did he have tight hamstrings? Yeah, a little bit, but it's just interesting to see their strategy from the back and from the sides.
Right.
And
Right.
you know, being virtual now, I mean, in the clinic, I would get my hands on them a little bit and just feel it. But now that I'm doing more virtually, I am having them do those movement patterns. I'm having them do a forward bend, narrow, wide. I'm having them do stand on a half foam roller to rule in or out the foot or see if that changes, and then
Mm-hmm.
screenshotting and see what looks better or worse, because we need to find the driving region, the driving influence that's causing this patient's symptoms. And the more, at least in the virtual setting, the more, not the more movement patterns, but the more variance that we add to that specific movement pattern, the more we're going to glean, the more we're going to be able to employ a better clinical reasoning process. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what I'm trying to say, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I've been doing, you know, a lot, just doing the narrow basic support. And, you know, we talked also about like the squat. I use the squat a lot, you know,
Mm-hmm.
just a lot. And I've had patients do same thing, narrow base of support squat, standing base of support squat. I mean, narrow, normal, and wide base of support squat.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really quite interesting because you can glean, once again, a lot at the hip, a lot at the foot, and pretty much everywhere. I mean, it's almost the same. It's not the same movement pattern as the forward bend, but you still can glean a lot with regards to center of mass. You know, there's a lot of patients who need to squat well. They need to, if they're a weightlifter and they need to squat well, and they're squatting and they're shifting their weight to one side. Why is that? So in the virtual setting, what you can do is, once again, vary their base of support, you know, even change neck position, you know, in those different positions, and see if that movement improves, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I've been doing a lot in the virtual setting. And I think because people have a problem, I always use squat when people have a problem sitting. But recently, there's this, we talked about him a while ago. This patient of mine had a really bad neck pain, and he contacted me about a month and a half ago. I hadn't seen him in a while, and his issue at the time was his like the neck was the driving influence, right, for his overall, his back and his neck pain, but he couldn't sit. So I had him do neck rotation, forward bending. That I didn't get anything from that. So I had him squat, and the minute he squatted, he's like, oh, my neck hurts. And once again, that goes into the whole, the neural tension piece. You know, I
Mm-hmm.
had him forward bend, and he's like, oh, my neck hurts. And I think that's really, the more movements we can assess that confirm what we're thinking, the
Mm-hmm.
better off we are. And the
Right.
squat is, for me, that movement, you know? Did anything else?
Exactly. And I think that's an important distinction, because somebody can sit with their knees bent and their hips bent and bend their head all the way down and turn it side to side, and it's never an issue.
No.
But when you stand them up and you have them bend over and their arms become involved too,
Yeah.
then all of a sudden you might start seeing where the issue really is.
Yeah.
You know, and it you know, you won't notice those neural tension pieces until you wind up the system from below. And then you can actually play with that. I love that example you just gave, because this is how I would do a bend over. This increases my neck pain. Okay, great. So instead of moving the head up and down, you know, bend the knees. Does it feel better?
Yep.
Does that change your neck pain? So is it the neck being tractioned, or is it neural tension?
Right.
And so right away we can bend the knees, and we can, you know, we can bring the knees apart a little bit and then bend the knees some more. Is that making this better, or is it still the same?
Yeah.
You know, and it could be, nope, it's still the same. And it's like, okay, something's happening, you know, that's up in the upper trunk that I need to get into and try to figure that out, because they don't like that traction and leaning bit as much as, you know, but it doesn't seem to have a neural tension component, because when we take the legs and the trunk and, you know, the hips out of it, you know, and let those flex and ease that neural system, and if their pain stays the same, it's either they're really wound up in their neural tension, or it's not a neural tension problem as much.
Yeah.
It's not one of the there may be some neural tension issues, but it's not going to be one of the drivers or the thing that we really need to jump in first to intervene on.
Yes, and I've been thinking about this a lot, you know, lately. Is, you know, we're movement specialists, so we are the experts in movement as a profession. And in the clinic, yes, we all do it. I admit, we get the hands on, we go, we want to just touch and move and straight leg raise. But in this whole, you know, new, you know, era, not new, but more telehealth, we've been challenged to really hone in on those visual skills and make diagnoses, you know, like movement system, MSI, if you want, diagnosis, and treat according to that, because we can't get our hands on the person. And I have found that we can adapt, because that's what we do best. And, you know, if someone squats and, you know, like this guy, he had neck pain, okay, yes, if bending his knees made him feel better, okay, that clinically reason, yes, there could be neural tension in the clinic. You can, I mean, I'm personally going to take a lot of this stuff back into the clinic and just play with it, because I've learned, I think that really enhances our clinical reasoning process. That's why I love, you know, putting, you know, raising their heels a little bit to see if that takes that weight shift to the right off. Or if we, you know, do I do a squat with an arm lift? I generally do. But a lot of people just squat normally. People don't just sit and don't use their arms. So that's why I have a squat with an arm lift. And I generally, and what's interesting, with this particular patient who had this issue with his neck, even though he had a problem sitting, I took a look at his head rotation and everything in standing. And I'm doing that a lot more now, once again, virtually, because I can see everything. But I, in the clinic, would tend to do much more in sitting. And I would go behind and, you know, occasionally go to the front. But now that I'm seeing everything from the front, like a squat, I look at from the back, generally. But in the virtual setting, I'm seeing it anteriorly in all these different views. And you can glean so much from that you don't really need to put your hands on them. You know, you don't.
Right. And I think the interesting thing about looking at cervical range of motion or cervical movement, again, willingness to move, active range of motion in the standing position versus the sitting position, is, again, I think we're starting to begin to start changing how we look at things neurologically and doing more differentials with the movement system. Is there lack of willing to move because of balance issues?
Yeah.
You know, do they have, you know, has their system learned, for whatever reason, to stop using wide bursts of range of motion in the standing position? In the sitting position, they may feel safe. Like, it's okay for me to turn my head around a lot. Or you may even find it very different, that they have limited rotation in their neck because they have limited trunk rotation in the seated posture.
Yes.
And then in the standing posture, they can actually bring the hips around a little. There's a little bit more freedom of movement up and down the kinetic chain for them. And they're willing to move their head further,
Yes.
and being able to kind of start to sort that out a little bit, because I really think that, well, it's been my experience as I've been working with people, especially people with pelvic health issues. I find that they have a lot of balance problems. And part of it is because they're just over recruiting their lower quarters so much. They're over recruiting their pelvic floor, they're over recruiting their quads or their adductors. They're just, whenever they're trying to stop leaking, they tend to over recruit. And I think that that begins to start driving pattern changes. And when we're over recruiting, we're not going to be accommodating to the earth as well. So the foot is supposed to pronate and fall into the earth when we walk, because that's how we figure out what the surface of the earth is and how we're going to respond up the kinetic chain to it. But it's like what you talk about all the time, Erica, with somebody who's for whatever reason has an over recruiting foot, a foot that's just not going, a foot that's just clawing, clawing into the ground. That changes how they squat. It changes how they step on one leg. It may change how they're running or how they're moving. And I find that over time has to change the balance system.
Yeah, for sure. Because
the vestibular system is just going to adapt to the new way. And then it's going to be reluctant to move back to the way it was. And if we, again, that's a dominance. It's not poor posture. We're talking about dominance. Dominant systems, dominant movement patterns are going to drive these systems to become part of it, because part of the movement system is the balance system. And the adaptations of that. And so with that, we lose reactivity. And this is why I see this a lot with pelvic health patients. I'm okay until somebody bumps into me.
Oh, interesting.
Or I accidentally run into something and then I leak. It's like, where's the reactivity in the system? I'm wondering if that, what's happening there. And so, that's, something, because then they can no longer keep that over recruiting kind of thing going. They have to automatically adjust. And the sudden perturbation is something they can't adjust to. Which is interesting, I think.
Oh, that is interesting. That is really interesting. I remember we had him on a podcast. I don't know who this was. This was a while ago. I think it was my patient who we had to progress her to higher loads. And we talked a lot about balance and getting her on Bosu ball. And she was a thorax. It was her main driver for some knee pain that she had, but we were progressing her. And when I started to get her doing lateral movement, jumping and things like that, she started to veer, and she's three children, and young kids. So it's really quite interesting, because I do think you're right. I think the balance is so important. And now that I'm thinking about it, the squatting, you can squat on a Bosu ball. I mean, have them squat, we have foam pads, those blue foam pads in the office. Not that I do this in the eval, but I would, just have them squat on a foam pad. See what you're, just use your imagination. And I think that, yes, we don't have all the time in the world, but I think with some of these movement patterns, you can they're much more efficient and time saving, in the clinic and certainly virtually, that, instead of just doing all the cardinal planes of movement, to really think about the patient's story. And this was on our most recent podcast, this patient of mine who was told not to sit, and she didn't sit for 9 months. And every time I watched her squat, she was afraid to move. I mean, this was, goes back, this woman was afraid to move. And interestingly, she stood for 9 months. And I will tell you, she didn't sit unless she was in an office meeting. And then if people listen to the podcast, it's really interesting. I treated her, we did some novel movements trying to get her, not to be afraid of sitting. When she sat, she had an existing neck issue. When she sat down, her neck started to bother her, because her gaze was different in standing versus sitting. And this is the recent podcast that dropped last week. And I will tell you, when she came in the second visit, when I treated her neck, she said to me, "Oh my God, that was a game changer." And I mean, that was the second visit. And the first visit, she was just afraid to sit. So when she was given the opportunity to sit, because her squat looked pretty okay. Her squat looked okay. And so I think I admittedly, was I looking at her eyes in balance? No. Okay. I was not, but I will in the future. So I just find that interesting because she had a really significantly upper neck restriction and had chronic headaches. So I think that the gaze and especially looking at people from the front when they forward bend, look at people from the front when they squat. It's been a whole eye opener for me, to be honest. And the last movement we wanted to talk about was step ups.
Yeah, so that builds into the balance system here.
Yeah.
So, being able to challenge the balance system and all of those because it's load transfer. When you're looking at squat and bend overs, you're transferring your load.
Yeah.
Moving in space is all load transfer, but so doing a step up or even a step down begins to challenge the balance system in a whole new way. How does a limb load? How does a trunk load with the limb loading? And which is a normal everyday thing that humans do is they step up all the time.
Yeah.
Step up onto curbs, they step up onto, hills, they climb hills, they walk, nothing to, even on, walking down the street, you have to step up and down on, cracked sidewalks or cobblestones or whatever it is that you may be walking on. Or if you're hiking, you're certainly going up and down all the time.
Yeah.
But really looking at how are people really spending time just, coping with the balance issue with it. And one of the things that I see a lot is that people are over recruiting. You see that they have difficulty stepping down because they just can't eccentrically lengthen to let it happen. They have trouble stepping up because it's hard to, to really bring their whole body weight over onto something. And I think part of the underlying thing that they're coping with is some basic underlying balance issues from over recruiting.
Oh, yes.
And in my population with people with back pain and hip pain and pelvic pain, knee pain, I mean, everybody with their persistent pain is a lot of over recruiting. And I think over time, that dominance of that over recruiting really drives the balance system. And that I really feel in many ways, it's one of the things that we just don't assess enough in musculoskeletal care.
Yep.
Unless they're of a certain age or they have falls.
Yes.
That we just don't really assess it enough. And I think that's where the beauty of variance comes in, because it really helps challenge the balance system a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
Because it really gets stagnant over time. And if their balance system isn't responding quickly or nimbly as it needs to when they're out in the environment, to me, that's one of the things that drives fear of movement.
Yes.
So it may be not that they're afraid of movement because they're afraid it's going to hurt. Of course, that's there. But what about if they're, deep down, their movement system, has a fear base that we're going to fall over if we do this. Now, they may not be conscious of that. You know what I'm saying? Nobody's walking around going, well, some people are when it's really bad, like I don't want to fall. And we know exactly what happens when people do that. They dramatically over recruit everything.
Oh, yes. Yeah,
exactly. So, and which is the worst thing you can do because, then you're like knocking over a vase, it's going to, fall and crack. It's not going to bend and move like it should.
Yeah.
And I find that that's something that is really, really, really underassessed.
Yeah.
And underappreciated with our clients that are coming at us from either persistent pain or musculoskeletal difficulties or stiffness or whatever it is they may be coming to us for. Not necessarily falls or neurological changes, but a lot of my clients have fallen down. A lot of my clients have had concussions. A lot of my clients have, they've had trauma. I see balance issues in pregnancy all the time. The third trimester is a high risk for falls. And I don't think it gets settled out in the postpartum time as well as it could be, because I see a lot of people with what they kind of call dizzy mommy syndrome, which is they quit riding rides and they never sit in the back seat, and most of the time they drive.
Right.
It's just like, where do you sit in the car? Oh, I drive. And it's like, why? Oh, because I'll get sick otherwise. Like, it's like there's a balance system problem. That's a huge balance system problem.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting because I've had hip pain on and off for a long time now, and it's much better. But I noticed that when I first started to step up or go up the subway stairs, right? It was killing me. I could barely go up the stairs. And I was like, am I weak? And I noticed that when I spin, I'm on the right side of the bike. So I, have this schema, like I can't move. Is it over recruiting? Maybe. I mean, I don't know. All I know is that when I do like side steps to the left, and I'm a lefty, I sidestep to the left to get into my, region of brain, whatever. I literally feel uncomfortable. And then when I go to the right, I could go to the right all day long. Sidestep to the right, left, not so much. So it begs the question, do, for example, there are a lot of people who row, for example, and they row a certain way. And then you should row the other way to sort of just train the brain. And a lot of coaches and trainers, not so much trainers, but people tend to asymmetrically load in a specific sport because that's what they're used to doing.
Right.
But I believe that you need to have many options, even if you're a right-handed thrower or whatever. You need to be able to change movement and not throw left-handed, but work left movement patterns to give yourself more choices. And a healthy system makes good choices.
Right, it has more choices to make.
Exactly.
Sure.
Exactly.
And I think that's, and it's not what came first, the chicken or the egg, but these systems have to be considered in tandem, I think. And that's why I like functional movement patterns versus isolated. There's stuff to be learned from isolated joint movements. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot to be learned from that. But I like to see how the system is working together because it's a systems approach. And you have to look at these systems in tandem. You can't rule out or not treat the balance system if you're going to be doing side steps on Erica, who doesn't want to go to the left side. It would be kind of fun to take you and do some balance stuff with you and see if that actually began to increase it immediately. Or if there would still be kind of that like that's kind of how you get to play and have fun. It's like, so somebody can't like maybe sidestep to the left as easily as they can go to the right. Like, oh, this feels so good, I don't like it over here. And you can kind of just see the hesitation or the movement. And they need that perhaps for whatever you're working on. It's always fun for me to bring in the eyes and the head and do some stuff like, let's get some eye movement going. Let's do some trunk movement. Let's get the arms moving to the left. Let's even just do some shifting, and let's get the head moving in different ways. Change it up, and now let's see, does it make it easier?
Yeah, and I think if we cue the eyes like that's look at where you're throwing, or look at where you just look. And I know that we've mentioned this many times, but for people who have not heard this, do you remember oh God, the guy who's the physical therapist for the Washington Wizards? He had that issue. One of the guys had an ACL or something like that. He's a big basketball team, and that he basically could tell from the way he landed that he tore his ACL or whatever, like midair, because of some balance.
Right, because he was watching a reflexive pattern happen that was going to give the guy a slowed reaction on planting his foot down as he came down.
Right.
Because as he was turning and looking and doing something with his arm up one way, the whole rest of the body was pulling into an old reflexive, just a buried reflexive movement pattern that hadn't been, like he said, in his mind, he said it wasn't correctly reintegrated, or we didn't spend the time to reintegrate these deeper patterns that show up in aerial athletes.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And so you've got basketball players who are up in the air doing these things. They need to land. The same, you see this all the time with wide receivers in football. They're in the air during a twist and a turn and catching a ball, and at some point they've got to be able to land. And kind of stick it, and be able to compensate. And so there's balance reintegration, I think we underappreciate. And just like when we're teaching somebody, knee exercises, or even like you and I were talking about with the heel pain, and Achilles tendinosis and things like that, is, what about the balance system? It's learning to like behave around, a muscular or a movement pattern stiffness that's being set up because of something that maybe had a pain response in the beginning, but now is being driven by a full movement, pattern experience of limping and staying off of it and walking funny around it. And now that balance system is being greatly affected. Maybe we get the foot and everything feeling better, but yet if we don't reintegrate those movements and bringing that piece in, then we're not going to get the totality of the rehab that I think we're looking for. And I think that really being able to kind of pull that system in and challenge that system
Yeah.
while we're actually getting that movement system to change, really challenge that balance system to be much more adaptive as well, can lend much more favorable results.
Yeah. So we started off
Yeah,
by
tough
doing
thing to research. Yeah.
exactly. So, we started off by talking about the forward bend, the squat, and then we're finishing up with the step up. And these are all great functional movement patterns. But now that we, if you want to take that a step further, have them, challenge the balance system, whether you have them, either move their arms or turn their head or whatever their story is. You need this to be relatable, or put them on a foam pad or
Hmm.
whatever is relevant to their issue. And
Hmm.
just for people listening, Susan, for people who don't, I mean, like we can assess a step up, but for people who don't feel comfortable assessing, a step up,
Hmm.
what would you suggest in terms of breaking that movement pattern down? Is there, I mean,
So there's an open chain and a closed chain component to it, of course. Like, can they lift their leg up and put it up on the step?
mhm.
And what
Single leg
about then?
standing,
So that becomes kind of a double thing. Like, it's an open chain on one side and it's a loading on the other side.
right,
How do they cope with that? Is it because they're not loading adequately on the, like, say it's the right leg's going up, is the left side not loading well?
right, right,
So, or is that why they're not getting the foot up there?
right.
Are they doing like this big twist to like make it happen?
Hmm.
What's happening with that open chain movement? Can't do they have the open chain movement to do it? But what's happening to the system as it loads on the
Yeah,
left side? And then it becomes different. Now we're going from, we're moving into kind of a concentric loading, with the quads and the glutes to lift us up and bring us forward over our foot, and then we're also balancing onto that one foot. So can we not only like shift and do the balance, but do the loading,
hmm, hmm,
and does it look like we have a huge shift going on? And if we do, why?
right.
Is it because muscles aren't adequately recruiting? Are they over recruiting? Are they under recruiting? What's going on? So you can just spend time and play with that and look at it on both sides. Then go ahead and do it on the other side,
Yeah,
and just start making some general hypotheses about, where's the problem? If I can give them support and they go to lift that right foot, like I'll just say, just grab the handrail and now lift the right foot and see if it's better.
yeah,
Does that make it easier for them? If it's a problem lifting the foot up or the leg up, because like maybe it hurts my hip when I lift my knee up to
mhm,
put my foot on the step and then hold the rail, it doesn't make it any better, then we know we have probably some sort of irritation in there,
yeah, exactly.
something that's inhibiting those muscles from working well, or it's painful.
Yeah,
But if it, giving them support actually makes it better, then it's like, what's the load? It's a loading problem on the opposite
on the opposite
side,
side,
and being
right.
able to kind of start to tease that out. And I
Yeah,
think that's where it gets to be a lot of fun. Is
yeah, just
what
break
change. So if it's a problem, change it immediately. Like,
it.
put your foot over here when you step up. Try
Yeah,
that. See if it works. Put it out to the side further.
yeah,
Maybe, let's see if we can't make this feel a little bit better. Let's see if we can, if we change some of these patterns, does that actually begin to make that whole pattern of the step up even easier or better
yes,
for
yes. So,
them?
yes, so you break down the movement pattern, right open chain hip flexion, left closed chain one-legged stance, and reverse. So if
Hmm.
that's a skill that, a step up is hard to assess, break the movement pattern down. The squat's fairly straightforward, forwarding bend is fairly straightforward, but there are other movement patterns that may be difficult. For example, a skater. You can, assess a squat. There's many different things that you can assess depending on what the person's main issue is. If they can't skate, you need to squat to skate. So just think about what movement patterns that you're comfortable assessing, depending on what the person's coming in with, and you will still come up with a pretty decent hypothesis. So that's where we wanted to go to today. Do we have any questions or comments or anything like that?
I'm just looking to see. I wanted to say hi to Jenny and
Uh,
Annette and Trina and Noah and Karen. I feel like I'm on Romper Room. Hello.
I didn't see this. I
Hi,
never.
Karen. I miss you. Annette is telling us that she agrees with assessing the patient's balance. It
Yeah.
has a
Oh,
big
fantastic.
impact on affecting the whole kinetic chain and causing a lot of the muscle imbalances developing over and under active muscles in coordination, resulting in the fear of movements. Yes, and the systems I think need to be addressed in tandem for sure. And I totally agree. So this has been fun.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us, everyone. And for those of you who listen later, thanks for dropping in. You'll find you can always go into our Facebook group and hear these Facebook Lives again. If you're not around where you want to do Facebook Lives on Facebook, you can always go into our YouTube channel, toughtotreat.com, and find us. And we have these videos up there as well.
Yes, we do. We hope you enjoyed, everybody. Be well. Stay safe. All right. Bye.